Hi, my name is Natasha Kessler. I'm working with Stephanie Aguilar, and this is our project on the history of behaviorism. Defining behaviorism. Behaviorism is the theory that human and animal behavior can be explained in the terms of conditioning, without appeal to thoughts or feelings, and that psychological disorders are best treated by altering behavior patterns. In more simple terms, behaviorism is the study of behaviors of a human or animal that does not focus on internal emotions or thoughts. One of the first examples of behaviorism was the law of effect. Law of effect was a principle developed by Edward Thorndike in 1898. It stated, responses that produce a satisfying effect in a particular situation become more likely to occur again in that situation, and responses that produce a discomforting effect become less likely to occur again in that situation. Thorndike did experiments putting animals, often cats, into a puzzle box with the reward of food outside. At first, the animal would take its time, but eventually it would find its way out of the box. When the experiment was repeated with the same animal, the amount of time it took for the animal to escape consistently decreased. Pavlov's dogs. In the 1890s, Ivan Pavlov's research on dogs led him to discover what we now call classical conditioning. Pavlov was originally researching dogs' digestion. He wanted to measure the saliva a dog produces when it is given food, so he inserted small test tubes into dogs' cheeks so he could record results. He began to notice that over time the dogs began to salivate when they heard the lab assistant's footsteps. The dogs were now conditioned to salivate for what was previously a neutral stimulus. Major influences. John B. Watson. He established the psychological school of behaviorism. He wrote Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, originally presented as a lecture at Columbia University in 1913 and was first published by Psychological Review. He was the editor of Psychological Review from 1910 to 1915 and conducted the famous Little Albert experiments. B.F. Skinner. He was the Edgar Pierce Professor of Psychology at Harvard University from 1958 to 1974. He developed behavior analysis, a philosophy of science that he called radical behaviorism, and invented the operant conditioning chamber, also known as the Skinner box. Clark L. Hull. He was known for his work on the drive theory, which attempts to define, analyze, and classify psychological drives. He authored Mathematico-Destructive Theory of Rote Learning in 1940 and Principles of Behavior in 1943. He was the first modern psychologist to study hypnosis and one of the most frequently cited psychologists during the 1940s and 50s. Albert Bandura, widely considered one of the greatest American psychologists of all time. He was the 82nd president of the American Psychological Association and one of the youngest to ever be elected at the age of 48. He was the originator of the social learning theory, a theory that new behaviors can be acquired by observing and imitating others. He is the most cited living psychologist. He conducted the famous Bobo doll experiments and was a major influence in the transition between behaviorism and cognitive psychology.
Little Albert Experiment. This study was conducted by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner in 1920 at Johns Hopkins University. The Little Albert Experiment is considered to be among the most unethical psychological experiments of all time. The hypothesis was that through a series of pairings, they could condition a 9-month-old child to develop irrational fear. The experiment began by placing a white rat in front of the infant, who initially had no fear of the animal. Watson then produced a loud sound by striking a steel bar with a hammer every time little Albert was presented with the rat. After several pairings, the noise, and the presentation of the rat, the boy began to cry and exhibit signs of fear every time the rat appeared in the room. This study proved that classical conditioning works on humans. One of the most important implications this finding has is that adult fears are often connected to early childhood experiences. Bobo doll experiment. The Bobo doll experiment was conducted by Albert Bandura between 1961 to 1963 at Stanford University. Its experiment's purpose was to prove that human behavior is largely based upon social imitation rather than inherited genetic factors. This study separated participants into 3 groups. 1. A group exposed to a video of an adult showing aggressive behavior towards the bubble doll. 2. A group exposed to a video of a passive adult playing with the bubble doll. 3. A control group. What researchers found was that children exposed to aggressive models were more likely to exhibit aggressive behavior towards the doll themselves, while the other group showed little imitative behavior towards the doll. The study also showed that boys exhibit more aggression when exposed to aggressive male models than boys exposed to aggressive female models. When exposed to aggressive male models, the number of aggressive instances exhibited by boys averaged 104 compared to 48.4 aggressive instances exhibited by boys who were exposed to aggressive female models. Types of behaviorism. Operant conditioning is a learning process in which responses are controlled by consequences. The likelihood of a certain response occurring is either increased or decreased due to either a reinforcement or a punishment consequence. A reinforcement helps to increase a behavior, while a punishment helps to decrease a behavior. This term was coined by B.F. Skinner. Types of reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, rewarding a desired behavior with an addition to a positive stimulus. Example, being given food or money. Negative reinforcement, rewarding a desired behavior with the removal of a negative stimulus. Example, hitting the snooze on your alarm clock, which means stopping the irritating noise. Types of punishment. Positive punishment, responding to an undesired behavior with an addition to a negative stimulus. Example, being slapped or shocked. Negative punishment, responding to an undesired stimulus with the removal of a positive stimulus. Example, taking away a child's video games. Classical conditioning is a learning process in which an association is made between two stimuli. With classical conditioning, two stimuli are linked together to produce a new learned response. One stimulus is a neutral and the other evokes a natural response. After learning the association, the neutral stimulus elicits the conditioned response, also known as Pavlovian conditioning.
The end of behaviorism. While behaviorism is still a valid study, its popularity has dropped dramatically and cognitive psychology has taken over. But why exactly did behaviorism drop out of the mainstream? During World War II, technology was evolving rapidly, and the military needed better ways to train troops and needed to better understand how to improve performance under duress. Behaviorism provided very little insight into these matters, so we looked to cognitive psychology instead. Developments in computer science shifted the way we thought about mental processes. Some researchers began to think of brains like computers, especially in regards to things like memory and storage retrieval. Noam Chomsky's 1959 critique of behaviorism started what we now call the cognitive revolution. That same year, the Harvard Center for Cognitive Studies was founded. This institutionalized the revolution and launched the field of cognitive science.
Thank you for watching our video. We hope you enjoyed and learned a lot about the history of behaviorism.